Welcome to the American Institute of Architects Kansas City Chapter's Legends and Leaders program. This series highlights AIA architects and others that have helped shape our community, lead the AIA, and mentor a new generation of designers. Bob Berkebile focuses on improving the quality of life in our society with integrity and spirit. In 2009, Bob received a Heinz Award from Teresa Heinz and the Heinz Family Foundation for his role in promoting green building design and for his commitment and actions towards restoring social, economic, and environmental vitality to American communities through sustainable architecture and planning. Among his contributions to the industry, Bob is the founding chairman of the American Institute of Architects National Committee on the Environment and was also instrumental in the formation of the U.S. Green Building Council and its LEED rating system. Bob is past president of the Kansas City AIA and has participated in many Kansas AIA initiatives, served on foundations and governmental commissions, and received numerous awards for his leadership in the environmental area. In 2022, the Board of Directors of the American Institute of Architects honored Bob Berkebile with the Edward C. Kemper Award. The Edward C. Kemper Award is given annually to an architect who has contributed significantly to the profession through service to the AIA. Bob is a graduate of the University of Kansas. He is a recipient of the Distinguished Alumni Award and also received an honorary doctorate of law from the University of Missouri. Let's meet Bob.
Hi, Bob. It is so exciting to be talking to you about your career and the huge impact that you've had on architecture and sustainable design over the years. I'm very excited to ask you first of all, about your early career. So really, what got you interested in becoming an architect in the first place?
Before I knew it was architecture, I was designing and building things for my father, who was a German craftsman contractor. And I was scheduled by him and my grandfather, who hand-built tools for me at age 2, to become the 4th generation German craftsman contractor. And so for my father, I built a wood workshop and a home for my grandmother, and then a home for my parents before I went to college. So I was on a fast track to fulfill their dreams.
You really were. So you were acting as an architect before you were even in school. So
Right. Sometimes borderline illegally. So my mom was a school teacher, and she would take my brother and me into the woods or areas around our house and teach us to observe nature so that we could, the following year, predict where the best morel mushrooms would appear, or the best blackberries, or the best gooseberries. And since I was working with my dad in construction all the time, I borrowed some equipment and some lumber from him, and I built a world's record greenhouse in a world record oak tree behind our house in the forest. And I finally got the nerve to show him this design project, and I was worried because I thought he would be upset that I did this without his permission. But when he saw it, he got pretty excited, but he made me deconstruct it and reconstruct it to be sure it was more secure and more appropriate. I had, with my mom's perspective, done it in kind of a unique way that favored the tree. He then told me a way to make it more secure, which did more damage to the tree. And so it was that early childhood development that probably put me on the course.
and then how did that blossom into your early career? For instance, school or places that you worked, or early mentors, special projects that shaped your ongoing career?
Well, first of all, I went to University of Kansas to become a contractor. And so in my first interview with the counselor, they asked what I wanted to do, and I told them, and they said, we don't offer degrees in construction. You probably would want to be an engineer or an architect. Do you have a preference? And I said, well, not really. I mean, I want to be a contractor. And the counselor looked at my transcript and said, "Did you win a state art contest in the second grade?" I said, "Well, yeah, I did." And she said, "You should try architecture." And it was like a gift for me. I had no idea, but in the first semester, the courses were just like heaven for me. It was what preceded all the construction I'd done. I had been designing, but in a very rudimentary way. And with the background my mom had given me about observing nature, and with the skills they gave me, it was like a game for me.
What a wonderful start. Well, what were some of your early people that you worked for or worked with that influenced you?
That really started at KU. The first thing was that I decided to take life drawing outside the Department of Architecture, and I got really excited by that. And then I moved on to sculpture and silversmithing and ceramics. And I was so present in the Fine Arts Department that ultimately, 2 years later, the dean, Rushoff, asked if I would design his new home to be built at the edge of campus. So after me thinking about it and him consulting with the Dean of Architecture, that happened. So I designed and oversaw the construction of Phil Rushoff's home in West Lawrence while I was still a student. And my life has been a lot like that. I've always felt that I couldn't have on my own created those conditions. It was like what Joseph Campbell called invisible helping hands were always there, moving things around me to present opportunities that captured my imagination. And one of those, still at KU, was that our dean was a good friend of Buckminster Fuller. And he and Fuller decided that he would come to KU and do the math and build the first tensegrity structure. And the dean thought about this and ultimately selected 15 students just to be with him full time while he was there. And I was one of the 15. And probably within the second or third day, with me being with Fuller, he turned my life upside down. He taught me about systems thinking. He taught me about Spaceship Earth. He would say, "Bob, the only way to make significant change is to make the thing you're trying to change obsolete." So this would be one example of that kind of design. Once this was out, the game was over for dial phones, for rotary phones, etc. And his point was, he kept saying, "Bob, you're a good salesman, but you can't talk people into doing something they don't believe in. But if you make the thing you're trying to change obsolete by designing something so much better, then sales aren't required." And so that stuck with me. And he said, when you encounter a failure, don't run away from it. Run toward it, understand it, be informed by it, and create the most appropriate design.
Well, soon after, somewhere after your early career with other firms, you started BNIM. And that was with some of your coworkers, and these were partners of yours for life, as it turns out. Still are partners with you, really,
Sure.
friends and partners. So how did you build that kind of relationship with them? How did that come about? Did you find it in phases, or it was because you started so young at it?
That's a great question. And I think a lot of things are part of that answer for me. But one was, even as a kid, I was mentioning the greenhouse. I recruited all my buddies to build that greenhouse. We had to get all the lumber up in the tree, and it was a gang project. And the same at KU. When I started, I mentioned the home I had designed for the Dean of Fine Arts, but I designed a lake house for one of my fraternity brothers who was a wealthy banker's son and and wanted a bachelor's place on a lake. And so I knew how to design it, but I didn't know how to do a lot of things. And so I would seek out the best expertise I could and just ask if they would help. And usually I got really good answers. And so that became a pattern. I noticed how Bucky worked, and while he was the brilliant one in the room, we were working harder for him than we had ever worked. And so I started adopting some of those same tendencies, and I knew early on, as Einstein said, we are far more ignorant than knowledgeable. And so if I was trying to do something new, like design and build my first house, in this case my third or fourth house, I would seek out the best expertise available to me under those circumstances. And I learned immediately that really helped improve the quality of the end result. And so it became a strategy.
Of collaboration and partnerships.
I'm all about collaboration.
And that's held you in good stead
And I think that's back to your question about these long relationships. BNIM, and for that matter, the Committee on the Environment and the U.S. Green Building Council, at its core are really strong relationships. And if you look at my texts and emails, you'll find them coming from New Zealand, Brazil, Africa, because those are really good friends.
I love that. Well, this partnership at BNIM turned into a National Firm of the Year excellence, a form of excellence. What do you credit that to? How did it grow over the years?
Well, first of all, we got a great start at Kivett & Myers. Kivett & Myers, when I went to work there, when I left Vietnam, I came back to the city. I interviewed at, I think, 9 firms, and Kivett & Myers was the lowest salary offer of the 9. However, they were doing all the great work, and they were winning most of the design awards. And some of the other firm partners were saying, you don't want to work at BNIM, at Kivett & Myers, because they're so big and you won't get any real experience. Here you'll get the great experience. But most of them had started at Kivett & Myers. And so I took that job. And I discovered there a unique, open, supportive, creative environment where it was really easy to be exposed to great thinking, great design. There wasn't a lot of control. They, in a way, some would argue, gave us too much authority and control. But if you're a young architect wanting to learn, that's a wonderful environment. And that was documented over and over. When the firm decided to have an in-house design competition to design the new terminals at KCI, I think I was the youngest person in the competition, but I won the design competition. And normally, I think a firm would have given me a really nice bonus and assigned it to someone who knew what they were doing. But Clarence and Bruce Patty, who had hired me and who had been my fraternity brother before that, said, you won the competition and you're the project architect. And they surrounded me with expertise and maturity and experience that were required to do, the largest project the firm had ever done. Early in the design of KCI, I had a disagreement with Burns McDonnell, the prime consultant on the airport, about the design of the entry road, which was, in my mind, kind of a freeway, federal guidelines kind of approach to the airport. And I thought it was critical for our visitors entering the city to leave the terminal and be on a boulevard like the rest of the city. And I went to Clarence, my boss, and said, this is not working for us. And, you know, would you talk to them? And he said, I'll tell you what, I'll call Bob McDonald and you just go out there and work for a few days in their office and explain this to them. I'm sure, you know, it'll turn out right. So I did that. And I came back after a couple of days and said, Mr. Kivett, I think I need some help because they're citing federal highway regulations and I'm reading them. And I think what I'm proposing is appropriate, but they claim it isn't, and they're 60-year-old engineers and I'm a 20-something architect. And I'm gonna need some support. And he said, well, who would come to mind? And I said, well, Pete Walker of Sasaki Walker, I think would be. And he had just won some incredible national award. And I'd read an article, and so Clarence called him up. He didn't know him, but he called him up and told him the situation and asked if he would come, and he did. And he looked at my design and he said, no, this works. He said, why don't I take it back and I'll put it on our drawings and then we'll present it to them. So he did, and there was a meeting and there was a confrontation. And when Pete started explaining this, they read him the same standards. And he said, I'm familiar with those standards, but apparently you haven't seen, and he cited something new.
Clever.
I thought, whoa. And so Bob McDonald at the end of that conversation said, now we're through with this, right? And Frank Pittenger, the aviation director, said, the next time I want to hear about this is as we're cutting the ribbon to use it. So we all went away. And I'm driving Pete back to the airport, and I said, Pete, how could it be, they're designing highways all over the United States. How could they not know that new regulation? He said, I made it up. But his point was that I was right, that I had interpreted the regulations correctly. They were misinterpreting them in order to bully me into doing what they had wanted to do.
Bob, you were the project manager on the Hyatt Regency Hotel here in Kansas City, which later suffered a skywalk collapse that killed a number of people, I think 113 people. It was a tragedy. And I wonder what you learned from that experience, how that affected your career, what advice you would say about that.
Well, first of all, I wasn't the project manager. My friend and partner, Casey Cassius, was the project manager, and I was the principal in charge. The Hyatt clearly changed my life. I spent the longest night of my life on the rescue team, removing 114 people who were either dead or soon to be dead, and more than 200 seriously injured people. And of course, my first question was, did I kill all these people? But as that question was answered by failure analysis experts and the courts, the questions that surfaced were, well, first of all, was the reality that even with an extraordinary client and team like we had on the Hyatt, that the largest building disaster in the history of this country before 9/11 could occur. But beyond that, when that question was clarified by failure analysis experts and the National Center for Science and Technology and so on, the real questions that emerged were, what is the real impact of our designs on the people we intend to serve? Are we improving their quality of life, their health, their vitality, the vitality of the neighborhood, the watershed, the airshed, the job shed, or not? And it was those questions that have propelled me to this day forward, trying to, first of all, understand, and secondly, seek answers, or where they weren't present, develop answers to those questions. You know, I think we had $2.9 billion worth of lawsuits against me and the firm. And I think, I don't know if Tom mentioned this in his interview, but I think if Tom or Bruce would have said we would not survive. And credit to my colleagues and to AIA-KC for supporting us, because we did survive. And when these larger questions came to me, we not only survived, but we enjoyed the full embrace and support of AIA-KC in trying to answer these new questions. And I think that's unique. And I think I discovered over time, one of the reasons a professional organization exists is to provide that kind of support that needs to be extraordinary, and in this case was extraordinary.
Because you could see the influence on the larger community and the role that you played in it.
Well, I can now. Then questions were coming up that I couldn't answer. And again, I knew I was more ignorant than knowledgeable, but I knew enough to know that these are really important questions. And since I can't answer them, the firm can't answer them, AIA-KC can't answer them, that's why we took them to Washington and said, this is critical and you need to do the research. We need to fund this. And the board, and we had pretty good access because Bruce Patty, of course, was running for national president. He was already a director. But they listened. They gave us an audience. But after listening, they said, this sounds like a really big idea. It sounds really expensive. And we don't think it's a professional problem. We think it's more of an environmental problem. And probably you should talk to environmental groups. And so I came back pretty upset. And the chapter stepped up and said, you're right, we're going to make this happen. And so the decision was made within the chapter that we would take a resolution to the next convention, which fortunately for us was in St. Louis. So the chapter got on the train and took the train to St. Louis. And I introduced on the floor a resolution that was called CPR, Critical Planet Rescue. When I look back, it was pretty naive, but it's what we put together at the time. And importantly, Bruce Patty and Vernon Reed, who had some cred nationally, they both had been or were directors, helped us get on the phone and call a lot of people before we went. And so after I introduced this resolution and after the AIA board reported they had heard this and denied it, I think 6 national presidents spoke in favor of our resolution. And it passed unanimously. And because the board was not very happy about this, they made us a part of the Architecture and Energy Committee, and they gave them, I think, $4,000 or $5,000 extra to do this new research. But it was a great committee chaired by Greg Franta, who became a good friend. And Kurt Gastinger, who was president, stepped up, and he and I worked on this a lot. We really started code. At that time, the work had been assigned to the Architecture and Energy Committee, but that year at convention, they launched the Committee on the Environment with me as the founding chair. And fortunately for us and for the profession and for the country, that $1 million was the first of many checks. And so we were able to do new research. We were able to create a large global network of building experts. And
The Environmental Resource Guide.
I'm sorry?
Did the Environmental Resource Guide come out of that?
Yes.
It's really a movement.
Well, once they funded it, and once they knew it was a thing, then the staff started supporting it. And then we asked for, and they granted us a retreat here in Kansas City. And so the 10-person advisory board and 4 people of the executive staff came to Kansas City for 4 days. Homer Williams provided his house, where we had most of the meetings, looking over the city and imagining what we might be able to do to define a different outcome for the design profession. And so I was asked to host a meeting at AIA in the boardroom of an industry-wide dialogue, which 6 months later became U.S. Green Building Council. And I believe that the evolution of AIA's Committee on the Environment and the creation of U.S. Green Building Council and the lead rating system and then the World Green Building Council and the same system, and then ultimately Living Building Challenge, all grew out of this search for trying to find a more appropriate, loving, healing way to solve design problems.
Bob, to tie into your concepts and comments about AIA's role and the role of architects, and another big area that you've been involved in is post-disaster planning and preparation for potential disasters. I wonder if you could go into some of those projects.
Sure. And I would say that probably has had one of the most profound influences on my design attitude and my practice and how I engage in a conversation with community. It started in 1993 when a sales rep from Chicago called me, and the Great Mississippi Flood had just occurred. And she said, "Bob, what do you think is going to happen to all these communities that got flooded now?" And I said, "Well, they're probably going to get rebuilt." And she said, "I mean, the way they were?" And I said, "Yeah, probably the way they were." And she said, "Isn't that wrong?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "What are you going to do about it?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. Who are you?" And she said, "Well, I'm a paint salesman in Chicago, but I've heard of your work, and I know this is wrong, and would you put together a national team like you did for the White House to take a look at this and to give FEMA better advice?" And I said, "Well, let me think about it." And she said, "Why don't you think about it and I'll try to raise the money." And she called back in 3 days and had raised the money. And so I started putting together a team, which I did, 50 very diverse. It was kind of like the White House again. I mean, I could call really smart people and they would say yes. And so we spent about a month preparing, and we spent a week at Wingspread, the Frank Lloyd Wright design home for Johnson and Johnson's Wax. And we came up with some kind of startling ideas that were more about working with nature rather than trying to bend nature to our will. And we all flew home to finish up the report. We made all the decisions there, but we had to really develop the report. Before the report got to FEMA and Congress and the White House, 2 communities had gotten wind of this and demanded that we help them consider their new futures. And one thing led to another, and pretty soon now it's been 12, including New Orleans, Haiti, and Greensburg, Kansas. And there's some important lessons there, one of which is, even with the first ones, I had asked an astrophysicist who was with me on the charrette and a psychologist to help me design a process to educate my team of experts. Like one was flying from India. He knew nothing about the heart of America, especially these little cities in Illinois and Missouri. And I wanted them to learn in a short period of time the culture, what these people cared about, and the genius of that place. And so that we created this thing that we called community treasures to facilitate that dialogue. And I would first ask the entire community, and we would look for a gymnasium or something large enough to hold them. I would ask them what they really loved about the community, and then in breakout groups they would answer, and then come back and report to the group. And the second question was, what are the barriers? What's holding you back? Why are your kids going away to college and not returning? And they would answer that question. And then the third question was, what would you like to create that you've never had? What would make this the best thing ever? And so that process, we found, not only informed our team, but more importantly, it facilitated that neighborhood or that community determining who they really were and what was important and what they shared in common. And they were, for the first time, equipped to think about what to build back. And a lot of people followed that work. For example, Congressman Cleaver came to New Orleans to see what we were doing there. He, in fact, attended one of Brad Pitt's fundraisers, listened to the people who were being relocated into these homes. And then he started following Greensburg, which came after New Orleans. And he somehow, I declined in the beginning, but he talked us into taking a busload of community leaders and elected officials to Greensburg to see the results. And on the trip back, one of the women said, "Bob, it's too bad every community can't have a disaster." I said, "Oh my God, every community does have a disaster. It's the man-made disasters that's really what these natural disruptions do, is expose the man-made disasters that were already there, but they got revealed by this devastating event." And so, for my money, I vote for us to address these man-made disasters without waiting for them to be revealed. And so in the remainder of the trip, they first of all asked if we would show them how that works here in Kansas City, and we agreed. And then they spent the rest of the trip deciding what neighborhood in Kansas City, which became historic Manheim Park. And so we did in Manheim Park what we had been doing in those other communities. And it was a great experience for us, for the community, and for the elected officials to see how a community can be transformed. So Manheim Park is east of Troost. If you saw a Google map, aerial view, you would notice half the buildings are already missing. And what you couldn't see from the image is that half of the ones that remained were empty. And so they hold all the records at that time, held all the records for education, crime, health, everything you don't want, they had the record. After they developed their new plan and reclaimed the neighborhood, at the end of the first year, crime was down more than, I think, 26 or 29% in the first year. There was a public school that had been abandoned, had been dark for 20 years in the middle of the neighborhood that they wanted to reclaim and reuse. And so that was their first priority. And we were able to put together a development team and find funding to do that as the first phase, which became a LEED Platinum building for community services and housing. The second phase was to restore some of the empty homes in the neighborhood and as LEED Platinum homes. And the third phase was new infill. And we had a number of Kansas City architectural firms contribute designs, so they could choose from one of, I remember, 6 or 8 designs, and then we were going to fund the construction of the house. Just last week I drove through the community en route to their award-winning community garden, and I discovered about 20 new contemporary infill houses, single-family houses, and 1 small multifamily for special needs people under construction. It was amazing. And so phases 1 and 2 we did with special help and support and philanthropy, but phase 3 the private sector moved in and has taken.
It gives me a lead into the next question, which is what would be the advice you'd give young architects? Or another way to look at it is, what would you tell a young Bob Berkebile now that you've learned over the last 70 years of practice?
We could all benefit, and certainly humankind could benefit, if we acknowledge how truly ignorant we are and not be seduced by the new technology or the new things, but to try to be quiet enough and observant enough to know what the real life systems are telling us. And right now, the life systems are screaming at us so loudly that we're having to invent new terms to describe them, like atmospheric rivers, like the Thwaites ice shelf, which is now in Antarctica beginning to move more. The temperature of the water is 4 degrees above freezing between the ice and the continent. When it does slide in, we're told that it will raise global sea level 2 feet. Aside from all the other impacts it will have on temperature and salt and so on. Those are very loud signals, and I think it's imperative that we as designers observe first the reality of the environment within which we're designing and learn enough about nature to design with nature, not to stop it or resist it, which we have done throughout human history. And so in my case, when I received the Kemper Award in Chicago, after thanking my colleagues here at BNIM and AIA colleagues and friends all over the planet who had done the work that caused the award, my next words were a question, and that was, why are we not all shedding our pants? Because when we really look at these things, it should immediately trigger for us, this is the greatest design problem in the history of humankind. And so why wouldn't we as architects respond and create solutions that are appropriate for this critical moment? so that my grandkids will have a place to live.
Bob, I really want to thank you for your time this afternoon. You're going to give inspiration to many, many architects in the future, and you have to all of us as well. We appreciate all the work you've been doing and will do for Kansas City and for our profession. Thank you.